If you recall from our last episode, we went through some of the different functions of human resource management, or HRM. These included conducting a job analysis, planning, recruitment, selection, training and development, performance management, compensation and benefits, and employee separation. Each function of HRM plays a significant role in ultimately the performance of the organization. One function that's importance cannot be understated is selection. Selection, if you recall, is the process of determining which applicants have the knowledge, skills, and abilities necessary to perform the job in question. So really, we're trying to determine whether or not an applicant has a high likelihood of becoming a high-performing employee in our organization. By screening applicants with a combination of selection measures, we may be able to get a better insight into who is likely to excel. Now, there are a number of different measures that organizations use to determine this, some more valid than others. Regardless of the measures used, successful selection criteria must accomplish one important task. It must actually be a valid predictor of job performance. If applicants are required to take an intelligence test, the employer needs to be able to show that a certain level of intelligence matters. Simply incorporating selection criteria that doesn't relate to the job can be grounds for a potential lawsuit, especially if a certain group is adversely impacted. So now that we know the goal of the selection process, let's talk about some of the different selection criteria used in the hiring process. The first criteria that is commonly seen is an application form. Chances are you've completed some type of application form, perhaps recently. I want you to think about the type of information that was requested on the form. Certainly your name, education, work history, maybe references, and most likely your signature, verifying the information is accurate. Resumes are often included with applications as well. And although they're certainly one-sided, they can provide insight that may encourage the employer to take a further look at the applicant. Although you can't make a hiring decision solely based on application forms, it does allow you to identify applicants who lack the minimum qualifications needed to perform the job. After the initial application screening, we can use a number of different criteria. Reference checks are common, but typically only when the applicant has made it to the final round of the selection process. The reason for this is calling references tends to be a time-consuming process. References also tend to be overly positive, since the applicant hand-selected these individuals, and probably wouldn't include someone who would hurt their chances of employment. There's also the defamation and possible liability associated with it, so individuals who provide references are unlikely to provide negative information. Background checks represent another tool used during the selection process. The main purpose of a background check is to verify information provided by the applicant. Unfortunately, not all applicants will be entirely truthful during the selection process, so employers may enlist the services of a third party to verify academic credentials, work history, or even criminal history. With the increased popularity of social media, many employers are also turning to the internet to uncover information about applicants. Now, you may argue that this isn't fair and not an accurate representation of your performance as an employee, but look at it from the employer's perspective. They're likely expending a large number of resources on the hiring process, possibly even flying candidates out to interview. Once an applicant has been hired, they receive training and, of course, time to acclimate to their roles. Newer employees are more prone to mistakes, which obviously cost the organization money. And then there's the possibility that an employee may leave or be terminated, which means the hiring process starts all over. So this expenditure of time and energy certainly incentivizes employers to obtain as much information as applicants as possible so they can make a better hiring decision. Probably some of the more valid selection tools are tests. Selection tests are commonly divided into two categories: aptitude tests and achievement tests. While aptitude tests measure how well an applicant can learn new skills, achievement tests measure an applicant's existing knowledge and skills. Organizations can choose to measure physical ability, cognitive ability, personalities, honesty, and even actual job performance. For example, police officers and firefighters are often put through physical ability tests in their respective academies. Although measuring physical ability would be a stretch in most occupations, good physical condition is almost certainly going to lead to being a better police officer and firefighter, given the physical demands of the job. Cognitive ability tests have become increasingly popular, with even the NFL using a variation of a cognitive ability test called the Wonderlic. Although the results are mixed with regards to intelligence and performance in the NFL, other jobs see a much higher correlation. If an organization is going to use intelligence as a method of identifying potential employees, they must be able to show that a certain level of intelligence is necessary. This usually takes the form of an accurate job analysis, which we discussed briefly in last week's episode. With that said, the use of tests that measure general mental ability seem to be effective, as many studies point to a strong correlation between intelligence and job performance. In fact, intelligence tends to be the best predictor of future performance, with a criterion-related validity of 0.51. Another way to obtain more detailed information on applicants is to have them complete a personality test. Personality tests typically measure 5 different traits, including extroversion, adjustment, agreeableness, conscientiousness, and inquisitiveness. Out of these 5 traits, though, conscientiousness, which measures how dependable, organized, and achievement-oriented an applicant is, tends to be a strong indicator of job performance, as employers use it to measure worker motivation. The use of personality type tests, like the Myers-Briggs Personality Type Indicator, depend largely on the type of work in question. Measuring personality for a sales job probably makes the most sense, while other jobs may see less of a direct benefit. While employers commonly use applicant performance on these various tests to make assumptions related to future behavior, inaccuracies are a real problem. Perhaps a better approach is to actually have the applicants perform job-related tasks, which is referred to as a work sample. Although it probably isn't economical to have every applicant participate in a work sample, it might make sense to incorporate a work sample in the later rounds of the selection process. For example, when hiring for a call center, applicants may be asked to demonstrate their ability to handle a difficult customer. For sales positions, applicants may approach a potential customer and try to close a sale. Even prospective NFL athletes participate in the combine, where they are measured in a number of different areas like running, jumping, throwing, and catching. In order for a work sample to be effective, though, it must closely match what takes place on the job. Probably one of the more common selection measures is the interview. Chances are you've experienced an interview or two, so you're probably a little familiar with the process and the types of questions asked. Interviews allow the organization to get a first-hand look at an applicant's ability to present themselves. Interpersonal communication, which is difficult to identify on paper, can be measured in an interview. From an HR perspective, interviews are commonly separated into 2 categories: structured interviews and unstructured interviews. A structured interview takes place when the interviewee asks every applicant the same series of questions. This helps to ensure consistency in the interview process and also allows raters the ability to compare applicant responses. Another big reason why organizations use structured interviews: it ensures no potential illegal questions are asked of an applicant, like anything related to age, ethnicity, or whether the applicant has children. Now, an unstructured interview is the exact opposite. Interviewees are given much more flexibility in terms of asking questions, which is beneficial if the way the applicant responds spawns a series of new questions. Despite those benefits, unstructured interviews are rarely used in formal interviews, as the interviewee is likely to introduce a number of different biases that yield the interview ineffective. So, which of these selection measures should be used? Well, that depends on the organization and the job they're attempting to fill. Not all selection measures work in all situations. The important thing for the organization to consider is whether or not the measure actually helps better predict future job performance. Thank you for watching this video on human resource selection. In next week's video, we're going to look at the motivational benefits of goal setting and discuss the goal setting theory. For questions, please leave them in the comment box below, and I'll do my best to get back to them in a timely fashion. If you want more from Alan East Business Academy, you can subscribe to our channel, download our weekly podcast, which you can find on iTunes and Stitcher, or go to alaneastbusinessacademy.com, where you'll find additional content, quizzes, and more. Thanks for watching.